A small act of kindness turns into a shocking display of injustice when a racist Karen slaps two innocent black twins in a crowded grocery store. She thinks she can storm out without consequences. But little does she know, someone is watching. Someone who won't stay silent this time. This single moment sets off a chain reaction that exposes buried truths, confronts painful prejudices, and forces everyone involved to face the past. Who was watching, and how will this moment change their lives forever? Watch this story of courage, redemption, and second chances that will leave you breathless till the very end. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Amari's hands trembled as he took the water bottle from Mr. Reynolds. The fluorescent lights in the break room hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his sister's tear-stained face. Naomi sat hunched in a blue plastic chair, dabbing at her eyes with the tissue while trying to steady her breathing. "You're safe now," Mr. Reynolds said softly. His weathered face creased with concern. The store manager pulled up a chair and sat across from them, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Take your time. Just breathe." The vending machine's quiet buzz filled the silence as Amari struggled to unscrew the water bottle cap. His fingers felt numb, and the plastic kept slipping. Without a word, Mr. Reynolds reached over and helped him open it. "Thank you," Amari whispered, his voice barely audible. He took a small sip, the cool water helping to ease the tightness in his throat. Naomi sniffled beside him, her shoulders still shaking. "I want Mom," she said, fresh tears welling up in her eyes. "We've already called her," Mr. Reynolds assured them. "She's on her way right now. Officer Martinez is waiting outside, and she'd like to talk to you both when you're ready." Amari's stomach clenched at the mention of the police officer. He should have done something different, should have noticed sooner, should have protected Naomi better. The guilt pressed down on his chest like a heavy weight. The break room door opened, and Carol, one of the cashiers Amari recognized from their regular shopping trips, entered with 2 chocolate bars. "I thought you might need something sweet," she said, holding them out to the twins. Her kind smile reminded Amari of their grandmother. Naomi hesitated before accepting the candy, her fingers curling around the wrapper, but not opening it. Amari took his and managed a weak, "Thanks." "You two were so brave," Carol said, pulling up another chair. "What happened out there wasn't your fault. Not one bit." Amari stared at the chocolate bar in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. The wrapper crinkled as his grip tightened. "But I should have—" "No, son," Mr. Reynolds interrupted gently. "What you did was exactly right. You got your sister to safety and called for help. That's exactly what you should have done." A quiet sob escaped Naomi, and she leaned against her brother's shoulder. Amari wrapped an arm around her, feeling her trembling against him. The familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo mixed with the break room's coffee and cleaning supply smell. Is he still out there?" Naomi asked, her voice muffled against Amari's sleeve. "No, sweetheart," Carol assured her. "The police have him in custody. He can't hurt anyone now." Mr. Reynolds nodded, leaning forward slightly. "The store's security cameras caught everything. You don't have to worry about that man anymore." The tension in Amari's shoulders eased slightly at those words, but the fear still lingered, like a shadow at the edge of his vision. He glanced at the break room door, wishing their mom would walk through it right now. As if reading his thoughts, Mr. Reynolds checked his phone. "Your mother just pulled into the parking lot. Would you like me to go get her?" Both twins nodded eagerly, and Mr. Reynolds stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Before he reached the door, Amari found his voice again. "Mr. Reynolds?" he called out softly. The store manager turned back. "Thank you for helping us." The evening shadows stretched across their small kitchen as Vanessa guided her children to the dinner table. The abandoned pot of mac and cheese sat on the stove, a reminder of how quickly their normal afternoon had unraveled. Steam no longer rose from the pasta, but the familiar comfort food smell lingered in the air. "Let me just heat this up real quick," Vanessa said, trying to sound cheerful despite the heaviness in her heart. Naomi's grip on her hand tightened. "Don't go, Mama," Naomi whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Vanessa pulled her daughter closer, feeling the slight trembling in Naomi's small frame. "Baby, I'm just going to the stove. You can see me the whole time, okay?" Amari sat motionless at the table, his shoulders hunched as he stared at the empty plate before him. The usual sparkle in his eyes was gone, replaced by a distant, troubled look that made him seem years older than his 12 years. "Amari, honey?" Vanessa called softly. He didn't respond, lost in his thoughts. With Naomi still clinging to her left hand, Vanessa managed to reheat the mac and cheese one-handed. The microwave's hum filled the uncomfortable silence. When it beeped, Naomi jumped, pressing herself even closer to her mother's side. Vanessa served the food carefully, making sure everyone had an equal portion, just like always. The familiar routine felt strange now, almost surreal. The yellow cheese sauce steamed invitingly, but no one reached for their forks. "I'm not hungry," Amari mumbled, the first words he'd spoken since leaving the store. Vanessa pulled out her chair, guiding Naomi to sit beside her. Her daughter immediately scooted her chair closer until it touched Vanessa's, their shoulders pressed together. The kitchen light cast a warm glow over the table, but it couldn't dispel the shadow that seemed to have fallen over her children. "We should at least try to eat a little bit," Vanessa said gently, though her own appetite had vanished hours ago. She picked up her fork, hoping to set an example, but the weight of it felt wrong in her hand. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each silent moment. Outside, a car drove past, its headlights briefly illuminating their window. Naomi tensed at the sound, her small hand squeezing her mother's even tighter. The mac and cheese grew cold on their plates, untouched. Vanessa looked at her children, Amari lost in his thoughts, Naomi pressed against her side, and felt tears prick at her eyes. But she blinked them back, knowing she needed to be strong for them right now. The simple dinner she'd planned now sat like a mockery of their usual cheerful family meals. When Amari would tell jokes and Naomi would giggle, their laughter filling the small kitchen with joy. Now, only silence filled the space between them, heavy with unspoken fears and confusion. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Vanessa walked with her children, their footsteps falling in sync. Naomi's small hand gripped her left tightly, while Amari held onto her right with unusual firmness. The familiar route to school felt different today, charged with an unseen tension that made every step feel deliberate. Mrs. Peterson's lace curtains twitched as they passed her house. Vanessa caught a glimpse of the elderly woman's face before she quickly disappeared behind the fabric. The movement was subtle, but it sent a clear message that made Vanessa's stomach tighten. The Martinez family was usually out watering their flowers at this time, exchanging cheerful good mornings. Today, Mr. Martinez saw them coming and hurried inside, the garden hose still running on the lawn. Water pooled on the grass, spilling onto the sidewalk, forcing them to step around it. "Mama," Naomi whispered, pressing closer to Vanessa's side, "why is everyone acting weird?" Vanessa squeezed her daughter's hand reassuringly. "Some people just don't know how to act when something important happens in the neighborhood, baby." They passed the blue house where the Thompson kids lived. Usually the children would be playing in the front yard, waiting for the school bus. Today, Their mother hustled them inside as Vanessa and the twins approached, casting a quick, uncomfortable glance over her shoulder. The weight of those avoiding eyes and shifting curtains pressed down on Vanessa's shoulders, but she held her head high. She felt Amari's hand trembling slightly in hers and gave it a gentle squeeze. Her son walked straighter, mimicking her posture, though she could see the worry in his eyes. At the corner house, old Mr. Jenkins was retrieving his morning paper. His eyes met Vanessa's for a moment before he looked away, suddenly very interested in the headlines. The paper shook slightly in his weathered hands as he pretended to read. "Remember what we talked about," Vanessa said softly to her children as they walked. "We hold our heads high because we've done nothing wrong. We're strong, we're together, and that's what matters." The morning air felt thick with unspoken words and darting glances. More curtains shifted, more doors quietly closed, more neighbors found sudden reasons to look away. Each averted gaze and hushed retreat reinforced the invisible wall that seemed to have sprung up overnight between them and their community. But Vanessa kept walking, her chin up, her steps steady, her children's hands warm and secure in hers. She was their anchor in this storm of whispers and sideways looks, and she wouldn't let them see her falter. The kitchen was filled with the warm aroma of pancakes as Vanessa flipped another golden circle onto the growing stack. Naomi and Amari sat at the table, quietly coloring in their school notebooks while waiting for breakfast. The morning sunshine streamed through the window, making the worn linoleum floor shine. When her phone buzzed on the counter, Vanessa quickly wiped her hands on her apron. The caller ID showed Mr. Thompson, attorney, and her heart skipped a beat. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams," his deep voice came through the line. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "No, just making breakfast for the kids." Vanessa turned down the heat under the pancake pan. "Is everything okay?" "We've received notice of a pre-trial meeting scheduled for tomorrow at 2 p.m. He paused, clearing his throat. "I should warn you. Carol Henderson has retained Wilson and Associates. They're one of the top firms in the county." Vanessa's hand tightened around the phone. She glanced at her children, thankful they were absorbed in their coloring. What does that mean for us?" "They'll try to intimidate us with their resources," Mr. Thompson explained. "But facts are facts, Mrs. Williams. We have witness statements from Mr. Reynolds and security footage. They can't change what happened." The pancake on the griddle began to smoke slightly. Vanessa quickly moved it to the plate, her hands trembling. "Will I need to speak at the meeting?" "Yes, but I'll be right there with you. We should meet beforehand to prepare. Can you come to my office at noon?" Vanessa mentally calculated. She'd need to ask Mrs. Garcia next door to watch the twins after school. "I'll make it work," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. Williams," Mr. Thompson's tone softened, "I know they have expensive lawyers, but don't let that shake you. The truth is on our side." After hanging up, Vanessa stood still for a moment, gripping the edge of the counter. The weight of tomorrow's meeting pressed down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. "Mom?" Amari's voice broke through her thoughts. "The pancakes smell funny." She turned to find another pancake burning on the griddle, black smoke curling up toward the ceiling. Quickly switching off the stove, she forced a smile. "Just got a little distracted, baby. How about we have what's already made?" As she served her children breakfast, Vanessa's mind raced with worries about the meeting. Carol's expensive lawyers, with their polished shoes and designer suits, would try to make her feel small. But as she watched Naomi and Amari eat their breakfast, she straightened her spine. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure her children grew up in a world where they wouldn't be treated as less than anyone else. The evening sky had turned a deep purple when Vanessa's phone rang. She had just finished tucking the twins into bed, their peaceful breathing a stark contrast to the tension that had filled their day at the pretrial meeting. "Mrs. Williams, it's John Reynolds," the familiar voice said. "I hope I'm not calling too late." Vanessa sat down on her worn living room couch. "No, it's fine. I just got the kids to sleep." "I need to speak with you in person." His voice carried an urgency she hadn't heard before. "Could you meet me at the store? I know it's unusual, but this is important." Vanessa glanced at the clock. 9:45 p.m. "The store's closed, isn't it?" "Yes, but I have the keys. I'll meet you at the employee entrance in the back." He paused. "There's something you need to know before tomorrow's hearing." Her heart raced. "Is everything okay, Mr. Reynolds?" "It's better if we discuss this in person. Can you come now?" Vanessa looked down the hallway toward the twins' room. Mrs. Garcia was still awake. She could see the glow of her neighbor's TV through their shared wall. After a moment's hesitation, she said, "Give me 15 minutes." She quickly changed out of her pajamas and knocked on Mrs. Garcia's door. The elderly woman readily agreed to listen for the twins, squeezing Vanessa's hand with grandmotherly affection. The drive to Reynolds Market was eerily quiet. The usually busy parking lot sat empty under flickering streetlights, and the store's dark windows reflected her car's headlights as she pulled around back. Mr. Reynolds' familiar pickup truck was the only other vehicle in sight. He was waiting by the employee entrance, his normally neat appearance slightly disheveled. The store keys jingled nervously in his hands as he waved her over. "Thank you for coming," he said, unlocking the door. "I know this seems strange, but after what I heard today..." He led her through the dark store, past silent checkout counters and shadowy aisles, to his small office. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Vanessa could see the worry lines creasing his forehead. He gestured for her to take a seat in one of the two chairs facing his desk. The room smelled of coffee and paper, and a stack of security footage DVDs sat prominently on his cluttered desk. "Mrs. Williams," he began, settling into his chair, "Carol came to see me this afternoon. She tried to convince me to change my statement about what happened that day." The courthouse conference room felt smaller than Vanessa remembered. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished oak table, where both parties sat facing each other. Her lawyer, Marcus Bennett, arranged papers before him with practiced calm, but Vanessa could see tension in the set of his shoulders. Carol sat across from them, her designer blazer and perfectly styled hair a stark contrast to the dark circles under her eyes. Her husband, Robert's presence beside her seemed more protective than supportive, his hand resting on her arm as if to steady her. Their legal team, 3 attorneys in expensive suits, flanked them like a wall. Vanessa's thoughts drifted to Amari and Naomi, safe at school, but carrying the weight of recent events. She could almost hear Naomi's nervous giggle, see Amari's serious expression as he tried to understand adult matters beyond his years. Their absence left an ache in her chest. "Before we begin," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the silence, "I believe there's new evidence to be presented." He glanced at Mr. Reynolds, who sat quietly in the corner of the room, his store manager's badge still pinned to his shirt. Carol shifted in her chair, her manicured fingers drumming against the table's surface. The confident demeanor she'd displayed during previous meetings had cracked, revealing something that looked almost like fear. "Mrs. Peterson," Marcus continued, addressing Carol directly, "we have reason to believe your initial statement regarding the events at Reynolds' Market requires significant revision." Robert's hand tightened on Carol's arm. Their lead attorney leaned forward, his expression sharp. "Any new evidence should have been submitted through proper channels before this meeting. The information only came to light last night," Marcus replied, his tone measured but firm. He pulled out a manila envelope from his briefcase. "Mr. Reynolds has provided security footage that differs substantially from Mrs. Peterson's account." Carol's face paled. Her eyes darted to Mr. Reynolds, who met her gaze steadily. The room grew thick with tension as Marcus began laying out photographs taken from the security cameras. Vanessa's heart pounded as she looked at the images. They told a story so different from what Carol had claimed, a truth that had been buried beneath prejudice and pride. She thought of her children again, of their tears and confusion, of the way they'd asked why someone would lie about them. The lead attorney for Carol's team quickly called for a brief recess, but Vanessa could see in Carol's expression that something had shifted. The carefully constructed narrative was crumbling, and in its place, a different kind of conversation would have to begin. Vanessa's fingers trembled as she held the crumpled note, her heart pounding against her ribs. The morning sun felt suddenly cold on her skin as she read those 5 words again. Drop the case or else. The black ink seemed to blur before her eyes, and she quickly glanced up and down the quiet street, searching for watching eyes. Her neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, was watering her roses across the street, but turned away when Vanessa looked in her direction. The usual morning sounds, birds chirping, distant lawnmowers, children's voices from the playground down the block, felt muffled and far away. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Vanessa carefully folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. The mailbox hung open, its red flag still raised, looking innocent despite the threat it had contained. She gathered the rest of the mail, bills, advertisements, a magazine, and held them close to her chest like a shield. The short walk back to her front door felt endless. Her legs moved mechanically, each step deliberate and heavy. Inside, she could hear Amari and Naomi getting ready for school, their voices a reminder of exactly why she couldn't give in to fear. In the kitchen, Vanessa spread the threatening note on the counter, smoothing out its creases. Her hands were still shaking, but anger began to replace her initial fear. Someone was trying to intimidate her, to silence her children's truth with threats. She reached for her phone, took a photo of the note, then dialed Marcus Bennett's number. As it rang, she watched through the window as Amari helped Naomi tie her shoes in the living room, their heads bent together in concentration. Their innocence, their trust in her to make things right, strengthened her resolve. "Marcus, it's Vanessa," she said, when her lawyer answered, her voice stronger than she expected. "Someone left a threat in my mailbox this morning. I think we need to talk to the police." She wouldn't let fear win. Not when her children's dignity was at stake. Not when backing down would teach them that bullies could silence the truth with threats. The note in front of her was just paper, but her children's future, their sense of justice and self-worth, that was worth fighting for. The sound of Naomi's sobs pierced through Vanessa's sleep. She bolted upright, her heart racing as she threw off her covers and rushed down the hallway. The nightlight cast weak shadows on the walls as she pushed open Naomi's door. "Baby, what's wrong?" Vanessa whispered, finding her daughter curled into a tight ball on her bed. Naomi's stuffed bear, Mr. Buttons, was squeezed against her chest, its worn fur damp with tears. "I saw them again, Mama," Naomi hiccuped between sobs. "In my dreams. They were yelling at us, and nobody would help." Vanessa sat on the edge of the bed, gathering her daughter into her arms. Naomi's small body trembled against her as she stroked her hair, murmuring soft words of comfort. "You're safe now, baby. Mama's here. Nobody's going to hurt you." A floorboard creaked in the living room, drawing Vanessa's attention. Through the open door, she could see Amari pacing back and forth, his shoulders tense and his hands clenched into fists. The dim light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows across his troubled face. "It's all my fault," Amari muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "If I hadn't asked to go to that store, If I hadn't touched those stupid candy bars. He continued his restless movement, 5 steps one way, turn, 5 steps back. Amari, Vanessa called softly, still holding Naomi. Come here, baby. He paused his pacing, but didn't move closer. Naomi's having nightmares because of me. You got that scary note because of me. Everything's messed up because... Stop right there, Vanessa said firmly. She shifted Naomi gently and extended her free arm. Come here. Both of you need to hear this. Amari hesitated, then slowly walked to the bedroom. He stood awkwardly at the doorway until Vanessa patted the space beside her. When he finally sat down, she could feel the tension radiating from his body. None of this is your fault, she said, wrapping one arm around each of her children. What happened at the store, that was about other people's wrong choices, not yours. You two did nothing wrong. Nothing. Naomi sniffled and pressed closer to her mother. But why did they have to be so mean, Mama? The question hung heavy in the air, and Vanessa felt tears prick at her own eyes. She pulled her children tighter, feeling their hearts beat against her sides, remembering how small and precious they'd been as babies. Now here they were, facing things no child should have to face, carrying burdens no child should have to carry. The late afternoon sun filtered through the living room curtains as Vanessa sat across from her lawyer, Sarah Martinez, at the small dining table. A stack of papers lay between them, along with 2 cups of cooling coffee that Vanessa had made when Sarah arrived. The security footage from the store is going to be crucial, Sarah explained. Her voice kept low to avoid carrying into the next room where the twins were. Mr. Reynolds has been incredibly helpful in preserving everything. Vanessa nodded, glancing toward the living room where Amari and Naomi sat on the floor with their toys. Usually, Saturday afternoons were filled with their laughter and playful arguments, but today, they barely spoke above whispers. Naomi methodically brushed her doll's hair while Amari pushed a toy car back and forth, his movements mechanical and distracted. They're still struggling, Vanessa confided, turning back to Sarah. Naomi had nightmares again last night. Amari, he's carrying so much guilt. Sarah reached across the table, placing her hand over Vanessa's. That's exactly why we need to address the emotional impact in court. The trauma these children have experienced goes beyond just that one incident. The muffled sound of a car door slamming outside made both twins freeze. Vanessa watched as Naomi instinctively scooted closer to her brother, who put down his toy car to wrap a protective arm around her shoulders. We'll need to prepare them for their testimony, Sarah continued, pulling out another document. I know it's difficult, but their voices need to be heard. The judge needs to understand directly from them what happened that day. Vanessa's throat tightened. They're just babies, she whispered, fighting back tears. They shouldn't have to relive this. I know, Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. But they're also incredibly brave, just like their mother. And we'll make sure they're fully supported throughout the process. A small shuffling sound drew their attention. Amari stood in the doorway, his expression serious, beyond his years. Are you talking about the trial? He asked quietly. Yes, sweetheart, Vanessa answered, extending her hand toward him. Would you like to come sit with me? Amari hesitated, then walked over to lean against his mother's side. Naomi appeared behind him, clutching her doll, and quickly claimed Vanessa's other side. Sarah smiled warmly at the children, then met Vanessa's eyes. This is what we're fighting for, she said softly. Their right to feel safe, to be treated with dignity, to know that what happened to them was wrong and that they deserve justice. Vanessa hugged her children closer, feeling their small bodies pressed against her sides. The weight of what lay ahead felt enormous, but the precious warmth of her babies gave her strength. They would face this together, one step at a time. The small cafe sat just off the highway, its weathered sign creaking gently in the morning breeze. Vanessa arrived early, choosing a corner booth away from the windows. The place was nearly empty, with only an elderly couple sharing pancakes at the counter and a truck driver nursing his coffee near the door. When Ella walked in, Vanessa almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the confident store clerk who had stood by silently during the incident. Instead, a visibly shaken woman approached the table, her fingers twisting the strap of her purse. "Thank you for meeting me," Ella said softly, sliding into the booth. Her hands immediately went to the coffee cup the waitress brought over, wrapping around it as if seeking warmth despite the mild morning. "Your message surprised me," Vanessa admitted, studying the younger woman's face. Dark circles under Ella's eyes suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. Ella took a shaky breath. "I've been wanting to reach out for days, but—" She glanced around nervously before continuing. "Carol's been watching all of us at the store like hawks, making comments about loyalty, about keeping our jobs." The waitress stopped by to refill their cups, and both women fell silent until she moved away. Vanessa noticed how Ella's hands trembled as she added sugar to her coffee, spilling some on the table. "I saw everything that day," Ella continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way Carol followed your children around the store, making those awful comments. How she grabbed Naomi's arm." Ella's voice cracked. "I should have said something right then, but I was scared. I've worked there for 3 years, and I need this job for my college tuition." Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "But you're here now." "Because I can't sleep anymore," Ella confessed, finally meeting Vanessa's eyes. "Every night I see your daughter's face, how terrified she was, and Amari trying so hard to protect his sister." She wiped at her eyes with a napkin. "Carol's been doing this for months, you know. Making comments about certain customers, following them around. But that day with your kids, it went too far." "Why hasn't anyone reported her before?" Vanessa asked, though she already knew the answer. "She's Robert's wife. Her family practically owns half the businesses in town." Ella's fingers tightened around her cup. "But I've been keeping notes, dates, times, incidents, and I'm not the only one. There are other employees who've seen things too. We're willing to testify." The waiting room of Dr. Carter's office felt different from other medical spaces Vanessa had visited. Soft blue walls displayed colorful children's artwork, and plush chairs invited them to sink in and relax. A small fountain bubbled peacefully in the corner, its gentle sounds mixing with quiet, instrumental music that reminded Vanessa of rainfall on a spring morning. Naomi clutched her mother's hand while Amari sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a fish tank where bright tropical fish darted between coral decorations. A clownfish peeked out from behind an anemone, drawing a tiny smile from him. Vanessa noticed how her son's shoulders remained tense, even in this carefully designed, peaceful environment. His fingers twisted the hem of his shirt, a nervous habit he'd developed recently. When Dr. Carter emerged from her office, Vanessa was struck by the woman's gentle presence. She had warm brown eyes and a kind smile that reached them, her natural gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a cardigan in soft purple that made her look more like a grandmother than a doctor. A delicate silver pendant in the shape of a tree hung at her neck, catching the light as she moved. "Hello, Vanessa, Naomi, and Amari," Dr. Carter said, her voice melodic and soothing. "I'm Dr. Carter, but you can call me Sarah if you'd like." She knelt down to the twins' eye level, not too close, giving them space. Her movements were careful and deliberate. "Would you like to see where we'll be talking today?" Naomi pressed closer to Vanessa's side, half hiding behind her mother's arm, while Amari gave a slight nod. Dr. Carter led them into her therapy room, which looked more like a playroom than an office. One corner held a small table with art supplies, fresh crayons, markers, and pristine white paper arranged in rainbow order. Another area featured a dollhouse and various toys, including soft stuffed animals and wooden blocks. A comfortable couch with soft pillows lined one wall, while beanbag chairs in cheerful colors created cozy spots on a plush carpet that felt springy underfoot. "Mom can stay with us the whole time," Dr. Carter explained, noting the twins' hesitation. She gestured to the various seating options with an open palm. "This is your safe space. We can talk, or play, or just sit quietly. Whatever feels right to you. There's no pressure here." Vanessa felt her own anxiety easing as she watched Dr. Carter interact with her children. The therapist moved with deliberate slowness, giving the twins time to process each suggestion. She didn't push when Naomi shook her head at the offer to draw, or when Amari replied with only single words to her gentle questions. Instead, she simply nodded understanding, her expression remaining warm and patient. "Sometimes," Dr. Carter said, settling into a chair while the family chose spots on the couch, smoothing her cardigan as she sat, "big feelings can feel like too much to handle alone. That's why I'm here, to help you find ways to make those feelings more manageable. Think of me as someone who can help carry some of that weight." Vanessa wrapped an arm around each of her children, feeling them lean into her embrace. Naomi's curls tickled her chin, while Amari's steady breathing matched her own. For the first time since the incident at the store, she felt a glimmer of hope that they might find their way through this together. Maybe here, in this peaceful room with this gentle woman, they could begin to heal. Carol paced across the polished hardwood floors of her living room, her designer heels clicking with each step. The setting sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the tension in the room. Robert sat in his leather armchair surrounded by stacks of legal documents, his reading glasses perched low on his nose as he studied the papers with growing concern. "This is getting out of hand, Carol," Robert said, rubbing his temples. "The security footage from the store, it doesn't look good for you. Not good at all." Carol stopped pacing and spun to face him, her pearl necklace swaying with the sudden movement. "What do you mean? I was protecting our store from potential shoplifters. Anyone would have done the same thing. Those were children, Carol. 10-year-old children." Robert's voice carried a weight she wasn't used to hearing, thick with disappointment. He picked up a paper and held it up, the pages trembling slightly in his grip. "And according to these witness statements, you followed them through 3 aisles before confronting them. They say you were loud, aggressive even." "I was being thorough," Carol insisted, but her voice wavered slightly. She walked to the marble fireplace and straightened a family photo, avoiding her husband's gaze. Her reflection in the glass showed the strain around her eyes, the tight set of her jaw. "The store manager's statement contradicts everything you told me," Robert continued, leaning forward in his chair. "He says the twins are regular customers, that their mother shops there weekly. They've never had a single problem with them before." He shuffled through more papers, the rustling sound filling the tense silence. "And now there's this discrimination lawsuit." Carol's shoulders tensed, her designer blouse crinkling at the movement. "Those people always play the race card when things don't go their way. You know how they are." Robert stood up abruptly, papers falling to the floor in a scattered mess. "Those people? Do you even hear yourself?" His face flushed with frustration, the vein in his forehead pulsing. "Our legal fees are mounting, and our reputation in the community is taking a hit. The country club is already whispering about us. Mrs. Henderson canceled our golf game this weekend." Carol sank into the plush sofa, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly. For the first time, doubt crept into her expression, cracking her usual mask of certainty. "I was just trying to protect our interests," she said. But her words sounded hollow, even to her own ears, echoing emptily in the spacious room. "Was it worth it?" Robert asked quietly, his anger giving way to sadness. "Was it worth traumatizing 2 children? Worth the sleepless nights? Worth the way people look at us now?" Carol stared out the window at their manicured lawn, where the gardener was typically working at this hour, trimming their prized rose bushes. But today, like yesterday, he hadn't shown up. Small changes were adding up. Canceled dinner invitations, avoided gazes at the grocery store, whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Even their longtime housekeeper had given notice last week. "Maybe," Carol started, then stopped, twisting her diamond ring around her finger nervously. She'd never felt so unsure of herself, so off balance in her perfectly curated world. "Maybe I made a mistake." Robert looked at his wife, seeing past her perfect facade to the uncertainty beneath. The setting sun caught the silver in his hair as he asked softly, "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Vanessa stood at the entrance of Reynolds' grocery, her hand frozen on the glass door. The familiar open sign glowed warmly, but her heart hammered in her chest. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open, hearing the gentle chime that had never bothered her before today. The morning light streamed through the storefront windows, casting long shadows across the freshly mopped floors. A few early shoppers pushed their carts through the aisles, the wheels squeaking softly against the linoleum. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery section wafted through the air, usually comforting, but now doing little to ease her nerves. As she grabbed a shopping basket, her hands trembled slightly. The security camera above the entrance seemed to stare at her, its red light blinking steadily. She could still picture that day vividly. Naomi's tears, Amari's frightened face, Carol's accusing finger. An elderly woman walked past, offering a sympathetic smile. "Good morning, Vanessa," she said softly. It was Mrs. Chen, who had been shopping here for decades. The familiar face helped ground Vanessa in the present moment. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," Vanessa replied, managing a small smile. She made her way down the first aisle, her movements mechanical as she reached for items on her shopping list. The cereal aisle, where it all started, loomed ahead. Vanessa paused, taking another deep breath before turning into it. The boxes of colorful cereals seemed to mock her, reminding her of how something as simple as grocery shopping had turned into a nightmare. Carol wasn't here today, but Vanessa could feel the stares of other customers. Some looked away quickly when she caught their eye, while others offered encouraging nods. The whispers followed her like shadows. "That's the mother." "Did you hear about what happened?" "Such a shame." Vanessa straightened her back and lifted her chin, remembering what Mr. Reynolds had told her last night. "Don't let them make you feel unwelcome in a place that's always been yours too." His words, along with the thought of her twins safe at home with him, gave her strength. At the checkout, the young cashier, Tommy according to his name tag, smiled warmly. "Good to see you again, Ms. Johnson," he said, scanning her items with care. His genuine friendliness brought unexpected tears to her eyes, which she quickly blinked away. "Thank you, Tommy," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her throat. As she paid for her groceries, she noticed a "Zero Tolerance for Discrimination" sign newly posted near the register. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small acknowledgement that change was possible, even in their small town. Vanessa opened her door to find Mr. Reynolds holding a cardboard tray with 3 coffee cups and a white paper bag that smelled of fresh pastries. His kind eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up," he said, lifting the tray slightly. "And I brought hot chocolate for the kids." "You didn't have to," Vanessa started, but Mr. Reynolds shook his head. "Please, let an old grocer do something nice for a change." His voice was warm and genuine, making Vanessa step aside to let him in. The twins perked up from their spot on the floor, where they were building with blocks. "Mr. Reynolds," Naomi called out softly, her face brightening at the sight of him. Vanessa cleared some magazines from the coffee table as Mr. Reynolds set down their breakfast. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains, casting a gentle glow across the living room. Amari approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on the paper bag. "I got those bear claws you two liked so much from the bakery," Mr. Reynolds said, pulling out the pastries and setting them on napkins. The twins' eyes widened with delight. Vanessa settled into her armchair, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee cup. "The kids have been asking about you," she admitted. "They miss helping you stock the candy aisle." Mr. Reynolds chuckled, watching as Naomi and Amari returned to their block building, each carefully holding their treats. "Store's not the same without them either." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "How are they doing?" "Better, I think. Dr. Carter's been helping them process everything." Vanessa took a sip of her coffee, perfect, with just the right amount of cream. "The nightmares are less frequent now." A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched the twins play. Amari had started constructing what looked like a tower, while Naomi methodically sorted blocks by color. Their quiet concentration was interrupted only by occasional whispers to each other. "You know," Mr. Reynolds said softly, "I've seen a lot of customers come and go over the years. Some good, some not so good. But what you're doing, Vanessa, standing up for your children like this, it's important." Vanessa felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, touched by the simple sincerity in his words. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, putting them through all this." "You are," he said firmly. "Those kids need to know their mama's got their back. That's what they'll remember from all this. Not the bad parts, but how you fought for them." The courthouse's marble floors echoed with footsteps as Vanessa and her lawyer made their way through the security checkpoint. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed her purse on the conveyor belt. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the busy hallway. "Deep breaths," her lawyer, Sarah Matthews, reminded her gently. "Remember what we discussed." Vanessa nodded, smoothing down her navy blue blazer. She'd chosen it carefully that morning, wanting to look professional and composed. But her mind kept drifting back to the twins, hoping they were okay with Mrs. Chen next door. They passed by groups of people huddled in conversation, their voices hushed but urgent. A few glanced their way, and Vanessa felt the familiar weight of their stares. She lifted her chin slightly, remembering Dr. Carter's words about staying centered in difficult moments. "The hearing will be in courtroom C," Sarah explained, consulting her phone. "Judge Henderson is known for being fair and thorough. That works in our favor." As they approached the courtroom, Vanessa spotted Carol and Robert standing with their legal team. Carol wore an expensive-looking cream suit, her perfectly styled hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She whispered something to her lawyer, her eyes briefly meeting Vanessa's before looking away. "Mrs. Matthews," Carol's lead attorney called out, approaching them with measured steps. "A moment to discuss." Sarah squeezed Vanessa's arm reassuringly. "Wait here," she said quietly, before stepping aside with the other lawyer. Vanessa found a wooden bench nearby and sat down, her legs feeling suddenly weak. She pulled out her phone, checking for any messages from Mrs. Chen about the twins. There was one. "Kids are fine. Made pancakes, don't worry." A small smile crossed her face at the photo attached. Naomi and Amari at the breakfast table, syrup on their cheeks. The courthouse clock ticked steadily overhead, marking each passing minute. Vanessa watched as more people filtered into the building, other lawyers in crisp suits, courthouse staff carrying stacks of files, families looking as nervous as she felt. The air felt heavy with anticipation and unspoken words. Sarah returned, her expression carefully neutral. "They're trying to delay," she explained in a low voice, "but we're proceeding as planned. Are you ready?" Vanessa took one last deep breath, thinking of her children's faces in the breakfast photo. She stood up, straightening her shoulders. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm ready." The heavy wooden doors of Courtroom C loomed before them, their polished surface reflecting the morning light. Vanessa's heart pounded, but her steps were steady as she followed Sarah toward them. The courtroom fell silent as Amari made his way to the witness stand. His small frame seemed even tinier against the massive wooden chair, but his eyes held a quiet determination. The notebook he clutched, a gift from Dr. Carter, had "My Brave Thoughts" written on its blue cover in his careful handwriting. Vanessa's heart ached as she watched her son take the oath, his voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to be heard. She dabbed at her eyes with the crumpled tissue, feeling Sarah's reassuring hand on her arm. Judge Henderson leaned forward slightly, her expression gentle. "Hello, Amari. I know this might feel scary, but you're doing a very brave thing today. Just tell us what you remember, okay?" Amari nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of his notebook. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, glancing briefly at his mother before facing forward again. Sarah stood up, approaching the stand with measured steps. "Amari, can you tell us what happened that day at the grocery store?" He took a deep breath, just like Dr. Carter had taught him. "My sister and I were looking at the candy display," he began, his voice growing steadier. "We weren't touching anything, just looking. Then Mrs. Thompson came up behind us." As Amari recounted the events, Vanessa noticed Carol shifting uncomfortably in her seat. The tissue in Vanessa's hand was now completely shredded, but she couldn't take her eyes off her son. "She started yelling," Amari continued, his fingers tightening on the notebook. "She said we were stealing, but we weren't. We had money from our piggy banks. I tried to show her, but she wouldn't listen." A tear rolled down his cheek, but he wiped it away quickly. "She grabbed Naomi's arm really hard. That's when I yelled for help, and Mr. Reynolds came running." The defense attorney stood up, his expensive suit rustling. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is stating conclusions about the defendant's actions." "Overruled," Judge Henderson stated firmly. "The witness is describing what he observed directly. Continue, young man." Amari's voice grew stronger as he described how Mr. Reynolds had intervened, how scared his sister had been, how they'd waited in the break room until their mother arrived. Throughout his testimony, he kept one hand on his notebook, as if drawing strength from its presence. When Sarah asked him to identify the person who had grabbed his sister, Amari pointed at Carol without hesitation. "That's her," he said clearly. "She's wearing different clothes today, but that's definitely her." Ella's hands trembled as she smoothed her worn cotton dress, her eyes fixed on a spot just above the jury box. The afternoon sun streaming through the courthouse windows cast long shadows across her face, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights. "Ms. Martinez, how long did you work for Mrs. Thompson?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle but firm. 3 years, Ella replied, her voice barely audible at first. She cleared her throat and continued more strongly. "I started in 2020, right after they moved to the neighborhood." "And during your employment, did you witness Mrs. Thompson display similar behavior to what happened at the grocery store?" Ella's eyes flickered briefly to Carol before returning to their safe spot above the jury. "Yes," she said, twisting the tissue in her hands. "Mrs. Thompson, she had certain ways of treating people she thought were beneath her." "Could you give us specific examples?" "There was this time when Mrs. Thompson hosted a garden party," Ella began, her voice growing steadier. "A young delivery boy came to drop off some flowers. He was Hispanic, like me. Mrs. Thompson accused him of trying to steal her purse from the foyer table. She called the police before even checking the security cameras. Ella paused, taking a shaky breath. The footage showed he never went near her purse. Carol's attorney stood up sharply. "Objection, Your Honor. This incident is irrelevant to the case at hand." "Your Honor," Sarah countered, "this testimony establishes a pattern of behavior relevant to Mrs. Thompson's actions at the grocery store." "Overruled," Judge Henderson stated firmly. "Continue, Ms. Martinez." Ella straightened her shoulders slightly. There were other incidents, too. She would follow her Hispanic neighbors around at community events, watching them like they might steal something. She once called security on a black teenager who was just sitting on a bench in front of her house, waiting for his mom to pick him up from a friend's place. And how did these incidents make you feel, working in her home? "Scared," Ella admitted, her voice cracking. "Always scared I'd do something wrong and she'd accuse me too. I needed the job, but every day I felt like I was walking on eggshells." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "Did Mrs. Thompson ever make comments about race in your presence?" "Yes," Ella replied, her hands clenching in her lap. "She would say things like, 'Those people shouldn't be allowed in our neighborhood.' When she thought I couldn't hear, she'd tell her friends they needed to be more selective about who moved into the community." The courtroom remained silent as Ella's words hung in the air, heavy with years of pent-up truth. In the cramped conference room, Vanessa sat with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of lukewarm coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the institutional beige walls. Sarah, her lawyer, spread several documents across the scratched wooden table between them. "Ella's testimony was stronger than we hoped," Sarah said, her voice quiet but optimistic. "The jury's reactions were telling, especially when she described the incident with the delivery boy." Vanessa nodded slowly, remembering how several jurors had visibly reacted to Ella's words. "I saw one of the jurors shake her head when Ella talked about Carol's behavior at the country club, too." "Exactly," Sarah replied, shuffling through her notes. "And did you notice Mrs. Thompson's face when Ella mentioned the security footage? That kind of documented evidence adds weight to everything else." The coffee in Vanessa's cup had gone cold, but she took a sip anyway, needing something to steady her nerves. "I just keep thinking about how scared Ella looked up there. It took so much courage for her to come forward." "That's what makes her testimony so powerful," Sarah explained, leaning forward. "She had nothing to gain from this. If anything, speaking out might make it harder for her to find work with other wealthy families in town. The jury can see that." Vanessa set down her cup, her fingers tracing the rim absently. "When Ella described how Carol would talk about people of color behind their backs, it was exactly what happened with my children. The same dismissive tone, the same assumptions." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Vanessa's hand. "That's why this testimony matters so much. It shows a clear pattern, not just an isolated incident." Through the small window in the conference room door, Vanessa could see people walking past, their muffled footsteps echoing in the hallway. "Do you think it's enough?" she asked softly. "Combined with the security footage from the store and Mr. Reynolds' testimony? Yes, I think we're building a very strong case." Sarah began organizing her papers into neat piles. Ella's testimony helps paint a complete picture of Mrs. Thompson's behavior. It's not just about one incident anymore. It's about a pattern of discrimination that needs to be addressed. Vanessa straightened in her chair, feeling a small surge of hope. "The twins won't have to testify until tomorrow, right?" "That's right," Sarah confirmed, "and they're well prepared. Remember, we just need them to tell their truth, just like Ella did." The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the minutes until they would return to the courtroom. Vanessa took a deep breath, drawing strength from the morning's developments. For the first time since the trial began, She felt like justice might actually be possible. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Vanessa made her way to the witness stand. Her navy blue dress felt stiff and formal, but she had chosen it carefully that morning, wanting to project the dignity she felt her children deserved. As she settled into the hard wooden chair, she caught sight of Carol sitting at the defense table, her perfectly styled hair and expensive suit a stark contrast to the day of the incident. "Please state your name for the record," the court clerk requested. "Vanessa Marie Thompson," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Her lawyer approached with measured steps. "Mrs. Thompson, can you tell us about the events of March 15th at Reynolds Grocery?" Vanessa took a deep breath, picturing her children's faces as they played safely at home with Mr. Reynolds. "I was at work when I received a call from the store. My twins, Amari and Naomi, had stopped there after school to buy supplies for their art project." She paused, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mr. Reynolds told me there had been an incident. When I arrived, I found my children in the break room. Naomi was crying, and Amari—" her voice caught slightly. "Amari was just sitting there, so quiet. Too quiet for my usually talkative son." "What did your children tell you happened?" "They told me that while they were looking at art supplies, a woman, Mrs. Carol Preston, accused them of stealing. She hadn't just asked them questions. She'd grabbed Naomi's arm and demanded to search their backpacks. She called security without any evidence, just assumptions." Vanessa's eyes met the jury's, her gaze unwavering. "My children had their allowance money. They had their receipt from the previous week when they'd bought similar supplies. But Mrs. Preston didn't ask about any of that. She just saw two black children and decided they must be thieves." The courtroom remained silent as Vanessa continued, her voice growing stronger. "I've taught my children to be polite, to be respectful, to always do the right thing. That day, they were doing everything right. But none of that mattered, because someone looked at their skin color and saw something that wasn't there." She glanced at the empty seats where her children would normally sit, grateful they weren't present to relive this moment. The hardest part wasn't just that day. It's been watching how this has changed them. Naomi, who used to skip everywhere she went, now holds my hand so tight it hurts. Amari, who loved to explore every aisle of that store, now rushes through any shopping trip like he's afraid to be noticed. "And how has this affected you as a parent?" her lawyer asked gently. Vanessa straightened her shoulders. "Every parent wants their children to feel safe, to feel like they belong in their own community. That day, my children learned that some people would never see them that way, no matter what they did. As their mother, I have to fight not just for justice, but for their right to be children, innocent until proven guilty, just like everyone else." The judge's gavel echoed through the packed courtroom, bringing instant silence to the murmuring crowd. Vanessa's hands trembled in her lap as she watched Judge Martinez settle into his chair, his expression unreadable beneath his wire-rimmed glasses. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice strong and clear. Vanessa stood, smoothing her skirt with shaking hands. She glanced around the courtroom, taking in the sea of faces. Local reporters sat with notepads ready, while familiar faces from her neighborhood filled the back rows. Mr. Reynolds caught her eye from his seat near the front, offering a reassuring nod. Across the aisle, Carol sat rigidly beside her legal team. Her usually perfect posture showed signs of strain, and her manicured fingers fidgeted with the edge of her designer blazer. The confidence that had marked her earlier appearances had crumbled, replaced by an unmistakable nervousness that made her look smaller, more human. "Be seated," Judge Martinez instructed, shuffling through the papers before him. Vanessa's lawyer squeezed her arm gently as they sat down. The simple gesture steadied her, reminding her of all they'd been through to reach this moment. Her thoughts drifted to Amari and Naomi, safe at home with their trusted neighbor, Mrs. Chen. She'd promised to make them their favorite pancakes for breakfast, trying to keep the morning as normal as possible. The air in the courtroom felt heavy with anticipation. Every cough, every shuffle of papers seemed amplified in the tense silence. Vanessa caught a glimpse of Ella, Carol's former housekeeper, sitting quietly in the third row. The young woman's testimony had been a turning point in the trial, revealing a pattern of behavior that couldn't be ignored. Judge Martinez cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. Before we proceed with today's proceedings, I want to remind everyone present that this court demands absolute decorum. Any outbursts or disruptions will result in immediate removal from the courtroom. Vanessa's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She thought about the past weeks, the threatening note in her mailbox, her children's nightmares, the whispers and stares at the grocery store. But she also remembered the unexpected kindness, Mr. Reynolds's unwavering support, the neighbors who brought meals, and even strangers who sent encouraging messages after the story made local news. Judge Martinez adjusted his microphone, the small sound seeming to echo through the silent room. Every person present seemed to lean forward slightly, waiting for what would come next. The youth center's bright yellow walls and children's artwork seemed to mock Carol as she stood in the entrance, clutching her designer purse like a shield. Cheerful construction paper chains dangled from the ceiling, and motivational posters dotted the walls. The sound of children laughing echoed from somewhere down the hall, making her stomach twist with anxiety and shame. Mrs. Thompson, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, approached her, wearing a worn cardigan and a welcoming smile. "I'm Sandra, the center's director. We've been expecting you." Carol nodded stiffly, trying to hide how out of place she felt in her expensive clothes and perfectly styled hair. "Yes, I'm here for the—" Her voice trailed off, unable to say the words community service out loud. The leather of her purse creaked under her tight grip. "Follow me," Sandra said warmly, leading Carol through a corridor lined with colorful handprints and inspirational quotes about dreams and perseverance. "We'll start you in our after-school program. Many of our kids need help with homework and reading. Some of them don't have anyone at home who can assist them." They passed by several rooms filled with children of various ages. Some were bent over textbooks, while others worked on art projects, their faces scrunched in concentration. Carol's steps slowed as she noticed a young girl, about Naomi's age, struggling with a math worksheet. The child's determined expression reminded her painfully of her own daughter. "Here's where you'll be working." Sandra gestured to a bright room with small tables and chairs arranged in friendly clusters. Alphabet posters and multiplication tables decorated the walls. "Most of our volunteers start with homework help. The children really appreciate having someone to guide them through difficult problems." Carol's hands trembled slightly as she set her purse down on a nearby desk. The reality of what she'd done, what she'd almost cost these children, hit her with fresh force. These weren't just faces in a courtroom anymore. They were real children with hopes, dreams, and struggles of their own, each one as precious as Naomi. I don't know if I can do this," Carol whispered, more to herself than Sandra, her voice thick with uncertainty. Sandra touched her arm gently, her weathered hand warm and reassuring. "Everyone feels nervous their first day. Just remember, these kids don't care about your past mistakes. They just need someone to show them they matter." A small boy peeked around the doorframe, his backpack almost as big as he was, with scuffed sneakers and hopeful eyes. "Miss Sandra, can someone help me with my spelling? I got a test tomorrow." Sandra smiled encouragingly at Carol. "What do you say?" Ready to make a difference? Carol took a deep breath, remembering the judge's words about making amends and the importance of understanding the community she'd hurt. The weight of her actions pressed heavily on her shoulders, but maybe this was her chance to begin making things right. She straightened her shoulders and managed a small nod. "Yes," she said softly. "I'm ready to try." Carol sat at the art table, watching as Naomi carefully mixed colors on her palette. The girl's talent was obvious. Her brushstrokes were deliberate and confident, even if her demeanor remained hesitant. "That's a beautiful shade of blue," Carol offered quietly, careful to maintain the respectful distance they'd established over the past week. Naomi's hand paused briefly. "Thanks," she mumbled, not looking up from her work. The painting was taking shape, a peaceful garden scene with butterflies dancing among flowers. "You know," Carol ventured, "if you add just a touch of white to that blue, it might help the butterfly wings catch more light." She kept her voice gentle, free of the commanding tone she'd once wielded like a weapon. Naomi considered this for a moment, then reached for the white paint. As she mixed the colors, a subtle smile crossed her face at the resulting hue. "That does look better." Carol felt a small warmth in her chest. Not pride exactly, but something closer to gratitude. Every small interaction with Naomi reminded her of how much she needed to learn, to change. "My mom used to paint," Carol shared softly, surprising herself with the admission. "She always said art was like magic. It could make people feel things without using any words." This caught Naomi's attention. She glanced up briefly, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Really? What did she paint?" "Gardens mostly. Kind of like yours, actually." Carol smiled at the memory. She loved capturing the way light played through leaves and petals. Naomi dabbed her brush in the new blue mixture, carefully adding highlights to a butterfly's wing. "My mom says art helps me be brave," she said quietly. "When I'm scared, I can paint how I want things to be instead." The simple honesty in those words made Carol's throat tight. She thought about all the times she'd made children like Naomi feel afraid, all the damage her prejudices had caused. "That is brave," Carol replied, her voice slightly hoarse. "And this painting, it's going to be amazing in the competition." Naomi worked silently for a few minutes before asking, Could you hand me the yellow ochre? It's the brownish yellow one." "Of course." Carol passed the paint tube, noting how Naomi's shoulders weren't quite as tense as they had been at the start of their session. They continued working together quietly, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, painting everything in warm, hopeful light. Each small exchange felt like a tiny bridge being built, fragile but real. The youth center hummed with excitement as families and community members filled the transformed space. Colorful artwork lined the walls, each piece telling its own unique story. Naomi fidgeted with the hem of her yellow sundress as she walked between her mother and brother. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Vanessa assured her, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "And your painting is absolutely wonderful." Amari nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, sis, you're totally going to win." Naomi's butterfly garden painting hung in a prime spot near the center of the display. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows made the colors seem to glow, especially the ethereal blue wings of the butterflies that seemed to float off the canvas. Carol stood nearby, arranging refreshments on a table. When she saw the family enter, she gave them a small, tentative wave. The past weeks had softened the edges of their shared history, though healing was still a work in progress. "Naomi," Carol called softly, approaching with care. "I saved some special cookies just for you, the ones with the rainbow sprinkles you mentioned liking." Naomi's face brightened slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. Mr. Reynolds appeared, wearing a festive tie decorated with paintbrushes. "There's my favorite young artist," he exclaimed, his warm smile putting everyone at ease. "The judges are about to start their final round. How are you feeling?" "Nervous," Naomi admitted, leaning closer to her mother. "There are so many good paintings." "That's true," Mr. Reynolds agreed, "but none quite like yours. Those butterflies look ready to fly right off the canvas." More people gathered around Naomi's painting, murmuring appreciatively. An elderly woman wiped away tears as she studied the piece. "Such hope in those wings," she whispered to her companion. "Such beauty." Amari stood proudly next to his sister's artwork, answering questions from visitors about the techniques she'd used. "She worked really hard on getting the light just right," he explained to anyone who would listen. "See how the sunbeams hit the flowers?" Vanessa watched her children with tears shimmering in her eyes. After everything they'd been through, seeing Naomi's creativity bloom and Amari's protective pride filled her heart to bursting. Even Carol's presence felt different now. Less threatening, more supportive. The judges made their way through the displays, clipboards in hand, stopping to study each piece carefully. When they reached Naomi's painting, one judge gasped softly, calling her colleagues over for a closer look. They spoke in hushed tones, making notes and nodding. Naomi gripped her mother's hand tighter, holding her breath as the judges moved on. "You did your best," Vanessa whispered, kissing the top of her head. "That's what matters most." The youth center buzzed with after-school energy as Vanessa walked through the front doors. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting warm patches across the worn but clean floors. She smiled at the sound of children's laughter echoing from different rooms. Following the familiar path to the tutoring area, she found Amari sitting at a round table with two other students. His face was scrunched in concentration as he helped explain a math problem to a younger boy. Pride swelled in Vanessa's chest. Her son had found his confidence here, transforming from someone who needed help to someone who could offer it. "The decimal point moves this way," Amari explained patiently, pointing at the paper. "See how that changes the whole number?" In the art room next door, Naomi sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by colored pencils and large sheets of paper. Her latest sketch showed a vibrant scene of children playing, with butterflies and flowers weaving through the design. Carol sat nearby, offering gentle suggestions about color choices. "What if we made this section pop with some bright yellow?" Carol suggested, pointing to a corner of the sketch. "It could draw the eye up toward the butterflies." Naomi nodded thoughtfully, reaching for a yellow pencil. The tension that had once existed between them had mellowed into something resembling comfortable collaboration. Vanessa watched as her daughter freely shared her artistic vision with Carol, explaining the symbolism behind different elements of her design. "Mom," Naomi called out when she spotted Vanessa in the doorway. "Come see my mural design. Mr. Reynolds says if everyone likes it, they might let me paint it in the entrance hall." Vanessa crossed the room, careful not to step on any of the art supplies scattered across the floor. The sketch was beautiful, full of movement and joy, exactly what the youth center represented. "It's wonderful, sweetheart. All those colors will brighten up the whole building." Amari appeared in the doorway, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Are we heading home?" he asked, then noticed the sketch. "Whoa, Naomi! That's going to look amazing on the wall." Carol stood up, brushing eraser shavings from her pants. "Your children are quite remarkable, Vanessa," she said softly. "They've brought so much to our little community here." The sincerity in Carol's voice touched something in Vanessa's heart. The journey that had brought them all to this moment hadn't been easy, but watching her children thrive in this space made every difficult step worth it. "5 more minutes," Naomi pleaded, reaching for another colored pencil. "I just want to finish this section." "Take your time," Vanessa replied, settling into a nearby chair. She watched her daughter work, marveling at how the youth center had become more than just an after-school program. It had become a place of healing, growth, and unexpected connections. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window as Amari and Naomi sat at the table, surrounded by colorful construction paper, markers, and glitter glue. The sweet smell of pancakes still lingered in the air from breakfast, and their mother hummed softly while doing dishes nearby. "I want to make Mr. Johnson's card blue," Amari said, carefully selecting a marker. "He always wears blue shirts to tutoring." He began writing carefully, making sure each letter was neat and readable. Naomi spread her supplies across her side of the table, her artistic mind already planning each card's design. She'd already completed 3, one for Miss Sarah, who taught dance, another for Mr. Thompson, who ran the music program, and a third for Mrs. Martinez, who always brought fresh cookies on Fridays. "Mom," Naomi called out, "do we have any more of that sparkly paper?" Vanessa dried her hands and opened a drawer, pulling out some shimmering craft paper. "Here you go, sweetie. Making something special?" Naomi nodded, taking the paper with careful hands. "I want to make one for Carol." She paused, looking down at her work. "Is that okay?" Vanessa's eyes softened as she watched her daughter begin sketching. "Of course it is, honey." Naomi worked with extra care on Carol's card, drawing 2 figures sitting at an art table. One was taller with curly hair, the other smaller with pigtails. Both were smiling as they worked on a painting together. She added little details, the paintbrushes they often shared, the coffee cup Carol always brought with her, even the butterfly hair clip Naomi wore during their sessions. "That's really good," Amari said, peering over at his sister's work. "Carol's going to love it." "You think so?" Naomi asked, adding some final touches with her colored pencils. "I want to show her how much I appreciate her help with my art." Vanessa watched her children work, her heart full. The change in them over the past few months had been remarkable. Amari had found his voice through helping others, and Naomi had rediscovered her joy in art. Even more surprising was how Carol had become a positive presence in their lives, especially for Naomi. "Can you help me write something inside?" Naomi asked her mother, pushing the card forward. "I want it to be perfect." Vanessa pulled up a chair beside her daughter. "What would you like to say?" Naomi thought for a moment, twirling a pencil between her fingers. "I want to thank her for believing in my art, and for helping me believe in it too." The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Vanessa's name written in Mr. Reynolds' neat handwriting. Inside, she found a formal invitation printed on cream-colored paper, decorated with watercolor flowers around the edges. "Community Unity Meeting," she read aloud, her fingers tracing the embossed letters. "Building bridges, breaking barriers." Amari looked up from his homework at the kitchen table. "What's that, Mom?" "Mr. Reynolds is organizing a community meeting at the youth center," she explained, scanning the details. "This Saturday at 2 p.m. Naomi wandered in from the living room, curious. "Can we go? Mr. Reynolds always has good snacks at his events." Vanessa sat down, her mind racing with memories of previous community gatherings where she'd felt out of place, where whispered comments and sideways glances had made her want to disappear. But things were different now. The trial had changed something in their small town, sparking conversations that needed to happen. "I think," she began slowly, "I think we should go." The youth center's main hall was transformed when they arrived that Saturday. Chairs were arranged in a large circle rather than rows, and colorful posters decorated the walls with messages of unity and acceptance. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air. Mr. Reynolds greeted them at the door, his familiar warm smile putting Vanessa at ease. "I'm so glad you came," he said, giving each of the twins a high five. "We've got activities set up for the kids in the art room while we have our discussion." Vanessa watched as her children joined a small group of others their age, supervised by youth center volunteers. She recognized faces as she took her seat, parents from school, local business owners, and even Carol, sitting quietly in a corner, her community service badge still pinned to her shirt. The circle filled gradually with people from all corners of their community. Some Vanessa knew well, others she'd only seen in passing. Mr. Reynolds stood in the center, his presence commanding yet gentle. "Welcome, everyone," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "We're here today because our community has faced some hard truths lately. But more importantly, we're here because we want to do better." Vanessa felt her shoulders relax as she listened. Around the circle, she saw heads nodding, faces showing determination and hope. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly seen in her community, not as an outsider, but as a valued member whose voice mattered. The meeting was just beginning, but already she knew she'd made the right choice in coming. Sometimes, she realized, the bravest thing you could do was simply show up and be present, ready to both speak and listen. The spring breeze rustled through the oak trees as Vanessa pulled into the parking spot at Memorial Park. Her hands lingered on the steering wheel as she watched Carol setting up a checkered blanket near the playground. "Mom?" Amari's voice carried from the back seat. "Are you sure about this?" Vanessa turned to face her children, noting Naomi's anxious fidgeting with her dress hem. "Yes, sweetie. Sometimes people deserve a second chance when they're truly trying to change." They stepped out of the car, carrying the fruit salad they'd prepared that morning. Carol looked up, waving with a tentative smile that seemed so different from her previous haughty expressions. "Thank you for coming," Carol said softly, smoothing the blanket's wrinkles. "I wasn't sure you would." The picnic spread was impressive. Sandwiches arranged on a wooden platter, homemade lemonade in mason jars, and cookies that Carol mentioned she'd baked herself. "First time I've baked in years," she admitted with a self-conscious laugh. "I usually just order everything." Naomi sat cross-legged on the blanket, eyeing the chocolate chip cookies. "Did you really make these?" "I did," Carol nodded, "and I burned the first batch completely. Had to watch some YouTube videos to get it right." The tension began to ease as they shared the food. Amari discovered Carol had packed his favorite potato chips, and Naomi couldn't resist asking for a second cookie. The playground beckoned nearby, filled with the sounds of children's laughter. "The youth center has taught me so much," Carol said quietly to Vanessa, watching the twins walk toward the swings. "I never realized how much damage my prejudices were causing, not just to others, but to myself too." Vanessa observed Carol's expression, the genuine remorse in her eyes, the way her hands twisted nervously in her lap. "Change isn't easy," Vanessa acknowledged, "but recognizing the need for it is the first step." A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched Amari push his sister on the swing, their laughter carrying across the park. The afternoon sun painted everything in warm, golden light, and for the first time, the space between them felt less like a divide and more like a bridge. The cafe's soft jazz music mingled with the gentle clink of coffee cups as Vanessa pushed open the glass door. The evening crowd had thinned, leaving only a few customers scattered among the wooden tables. Carol sat in a corner booth, her normally perfect posture slightly hunched as she stirred her untouched coffee. Vanessa's footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor as she approached. Carol looked up, her eyes reflecting a vulnerability that Vanessa had never seen before. "Thank you for coming," Carol said, her voice quieter than usual. "I wasn't sure you would." Vanessa slid into the opposite seat, placing her purse beside her. "I almost didn't," she admitted, keeping her tone neutral. The waitress appeared and Vanessa ordered a chamomile tea. Carol's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Carol began, then paused as if searching for the right words. The youth center, it's changed me. Working with those kids, especially Naomi. She trailed off, blinking rapidly. Vanessa remained silent, watching as Carol struggled to continue. The waitress returned with the tea, and Vanessa took a careful sip, giving Carol time to collect her thoughts. I never really saw people before, Carol continued, her voice cracking. I mean, really saw them. I was so caught up in my own world, my own assumptions, the things I said that day in the store. She shook her head, disgust flashing across her face. I can't take them back, but I want you to know how deeply ashamed I am. Vanessa set down her cup, studying Carol's face. The perfectly maintained makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes or the genuine remorse in her expression. My parents, Carol hesitated, then pushed forward. They raised me with certain beliefs. I never questioned them. It was easier not to. But working at the center, getting to know the children, seeing their dreams and fears. She wiped at her eyes with a napkin. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. The cafe's overhead lights dimmed slightly as evening settled outside the windows. Carol reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. I'm making a donation to the youth center, she explained, placing it on the table. It's not much considering, but I want to help fund their art program. Naomi's talent deserves proper supplies and support. Vanessa looked at the envelope but didn't reach for it. This isn't about money, Carol. I know, Carol replied quickly. I know it's not. I want to do something meaningful, something that might help make up for the hurt I caused. She met Vanessa's gaze directly. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I understand now, and I'm trying to be better. The youth center buzzed with excitement as families streamed through the decorated entrance. Colorful balloons bobbed against the ceiling, and hand-painted banners created by the children transformed the usually plain walls into a vibrant gallery. The aroma of fresh-baked cookies and punch filled the air. Vanessa guided Amari and Naomi through the double doors, their faces lighting up at the festive atmosphere. Naomi clutched her art portfolio close to her chest. She'd been chosen to display her work alongside other young artists. Look, Mom, Amari pointed to a math achievement board where his name appeared in bright letters. Mr. Reynolds put up my tutoring progress. Vanessa squeezed his shoulder proudly. You've worked so hard, sweetheart. Naomi tugged at her mother's sleeve, gesturing toward the art display area where other children were setting up their pieces. Her eyes sparkled with anticipation. Go ahead, Vanessa encouraged. I'll help you set up. As they made their way across the room, familiar faces greeted them warmly. Parents who had once averted their eyes now smiled and waved. Children called out to Amari and Naomi, inviting them to join various activities. Mr. Reynolds appeared, wearing a festive tie covered in cartoon pencils. There's my star student and artist, he beamed. Naomi, we've saved a special spot for your mural design, right in the center. The girl's shy smile widened as she carefully removed her artwork from the portfolio. The piece showed children of different backgrounds playing together in a garden, with butterflies and birds soaring overhead. The words, growing together, arched across the top in flowing letters. Carol approached them hesitantly, carrying a tray of refreshments. Would anyone like some lemonade? She offered. Her voice was gentle, lacking its former sharp edge. Naomi looked up at her mother, then stepped forward to accept a cup. Thank you for helping me with the lettering, Miss Carol, she said softly. Carol's eyes misted slightly. You did all the hard work. I just gave a few suggestions. The room continued to fill with laughter and conversation as more families arrived. Children darted between activity stations, proudly showing off their achievements to parents and friends. The atmosphere felt light, hopeful, so different from the tension that had gripped their community just months before. Amari joined a group of his friends by the science fair display, explaining his project on renewable energy with growing confidence. Naomi stayed close to her art display, beaming as visitors stopped to admire her work and ask questions about her inspiration. Vanessa watched her children, her heart swelling with pride. They stood taller now, their voices stronger, their smiles more frequent. The youth center had become more than just an after-school program. It had become a place of healing, growth, and connection. Vanessa took a deep breath as the automatic doors slid open. The familiar chime and rush of cool air brought back memories of that day. But she squeezed her children's hands reassuringly. Amari and Naomi pressed closer to her sides as they stepped into the store. "We'll just get a few things," Vanessa said softly. "Stay close to me." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they made their way down the first aisle. Naomi's grip tightened when they passed the spot where everything had happened months ago. Vanessa noticed her daughter's breath quicken. "You're doing great, sweetie," she whispered. "We can take our time." Amari's eyes darted around, but his steps were steady. He'd grown stronger since his testimony in court, and Vanessa could see that quiet confidence now, even as his hand remained firmly in hers. A familiar face appeared at the end of the aisle. Mr. Reynolds, arranging items on a shelf. His warm smile helped ease some of the tension in Vanessa's shoulders. "Welcome back," he said gently, giving them space. "It's good to see you all." Naomi managed a small wave while Amari nodded. The simple interaction seemed to help ground them all. As they moved through the store, picking up items from their list, Vanessa noticed how the space felt different now. The fear that had lingered for so long was still there, but it felt more distant, like an old photograph fading at the edges. At the produce section, Naomi's grip loosened slightly as she pointed to some bright red apples. "Can we get those, Mom? They look good for drawing." "Of course," Vanessa smiled, grateful for this small sign of normalcy. She watched as Naomi carefully selected 3 apples, examining each one with an artist's eye. Amari helped bag the groceries, his movements becoming more relaxed as they continued shopping. When they passed other customers, there were no suspicious glances or whispered comments, just the ordinary bustle of everyday shopping. Near the dairy section, they ran into Mrs. Chen, one of the regulars from the youth center. She greeted them warmly, complimenting Naomi on her recent art display and asking Amari about his upcoming math competition. As they made their way to the checkout, Vanessa felt a mixture of pride and relief wash over her. This simple act of grocery shopping, something they'd done countless times before, had become a milestone in their healing journey. The cashier rang up their items with a friendly smile, and Vanessa noticed both twins standing taller. Their grips on her hands loosened, but not completely let go. They were making progress step by step, together.